Hello and welcome. This talk is entitled Sustainable Cities Are Accessible, Green, Blue and Fair. It speaks to the A-level syllabuses of AQA and GCE in relation to the key elements around urbanization, place and space. The talk is broken into three components. First of all, I'll explain a little bit about some of the complexities surrounding the term sustainability and the many ways in which it has been and is continuing to be used. Secondly, I'll explain the role of sustainability and sustainable cities within the current global sustainable development agenda that was adopted by the United Nations between 2015 and 2016. And then finally, I will review in detail the key elements of those three core characteristics of sustainability, namely accessibility, green-blueness, and fairness, before wrapping up with some conclusions. The term sustainability is one with which everybody will be familiar. But precisely because it is used in popular language, as well as in many different academic disciplines, professional communities of practice, and indeed by politicians with diverse agendas, there is often very little shared understanding of what it actually means. The term actually has quite a long and diverse history. Originated, as far as we can tell, in agronomy and range management, where it was designed to distinguish cultivation systems or livestock rearing systems that did not degrade the farmland or the range or the resource base on which it depended. And so the notion of carrying capacity, and then later the idea of maximum sustainable yield, were developed in order to reflect this long-term perspective, where the idea was not to maximize offtake or output in the short term, but to sustain it on a basis that did not degrade the grazing land or the fertility of the soil or any of its other attributes. And then more recently, it's been applied to human systems, where particularly in the context of urban areas, which is our principal focus today, it is much more complex. There are a few key milestones that you might usefully be aware of in terms of how the term came to reach its level of prominence and become a key element of global policy. Probably the first one is the Stockholm Conference on the Environment, which led to the establishment of the United Nations Environment Programme and also what is now UN Habitat, the UN specialist agency dealing with human settlements. A landmark publication was the so-called Blueprints for Survival, published by The Ecologist magazine in 1973. And then crucially, the report Our Common Future of the Brundtland Commission, or to give it its official title, the World Commission on Environment and Development, published in 1987. And this really popularized the concept, both in terms of its academic importance, but even more profoundly in terms of its policy relevance, to the point that today, as I'm sure you're all aware, it is on everybody's lips. It is mentioned in most annual reports or research plans or policy prospectuses of central, regional, local government, international agencies, private sector firms, civil society organizations, and universities and schools as well. The simplest definition, without getting into all the complexities, is implicit in what I said a few moments ago about the ability of a system or a city or a neighborhood or a community or a firm to continue operating in the long term without shooting itself in the foot, bluntly, undermining its resource base, degrading the environment on which it depends. And as I've already hinted, it's used very widely in diverse disciplines, fields, communities of practice. and exists in all sorts of forms, some of which require major changes to current practices, which we sometimes call strong sustainability, and others called weak forms, which require only tinkering at the edges or maybe some incremental changes, and often can be used quite cynically, such as the so-called greenwashing, in terms of which some private firms in particular, but other agencies as well, attempt to give the impression that they are acting sustainably, but actually they continue with what we might call business as usual. In 2015-16, the UN system adopted 5 related platforms which together constitute the current Sustainable Development Agenda of the international community. And these are, in the chronological order in which they were approved and adopted, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which replaces the earlier Hyogo Framework, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, of which the 17 Sustainable Development Goals constitute the monitoring and evaluation framework, and this is really the one of central relevance to us today. Thirdly, COP26, COP21, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, adopted in December 2015. Fourth, the Addis Ababa Agenda on Financing for Development. And the final component, the New Urban Agenda, which of course also relates to sustainable cities, was adopted at Habitat 3, the International Summit in Quito, Ecuador, in October 2016, and then ratified by the United Nations General Assembly in December that year. And here, illustrated in a diagram that many of you, I'm sure, will have seen because it's quite widely used these days, are the 17 SDGs in numerical order. You can read them for yourselves, but the one of central relevance to this talk today is number 11 on sustainable cities and communities. Its full title is actually to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. When the decision was taken to replace the original 8 Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, which ran from 2000 to 2015, there was widespread agreement that a larger number was required to represent more accurately the diversity and the complexity of sustainability. And the result, after a 3-year process, which was long and deep, involved sustained discussions and negotiations in most UN member countries, amongst interest groups and so on, was a decision that 17 represented the maximum that might reasonably be adopted. Each of these 17 goals comprises a series of targets, which in turn are to be assessed in terms of progress over the 15-year lifetime of the SDGs through a series of indicators. The logic of having a specifically urban SDG is threefold. Firstly, that traditional sectoral approaches, health, education, transport and so on, don't really have any integration or a particular spatial or territorial dimension, which is fundamentally what cities are. Secondly, that kind of spatial or place-based framing is essential in order to integrate all the other sectors and indeed to integrate the different spatial components, the sub-areas, the districts, neighborhoods, whatever you wish to call them, of an urban area. And the final part of the rationale is that since we live in a predominantly urban world, talking about sustainability without comprehending and measuring progress towards urban sustainability didn't really make much sense. Put differently, inverted, it means that urban sustainable development is essential in order to achieve overall societal or global sustainability. The other key terms to be mentioned there: safety. It's about both personal and institutional safety in the private domain, as well as in public space and everywhere in between. It's not just physical safety, but it's safety of data and confidentiality and all the other things that are of concern to us in that regard. Resilience, a big research topic, a subject of much debate and policy intervention in its own right, but very closely related to sustainability, can most simply be expressed as the ability of a person, a household, a community, an urban area in this case, to withstand shocks, to recover, and to bounce back better, if you like, in terms of improved equity, fairness, and justice. Sustainability we've already defined. The UN measures progress against these goals through a series of reporting mechanisms which take place through something called the High-Level Political Forum, HLPF, held in New York, initially face-to-face every July, but since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, principally online. And they publish an annual report, and this and the next slide give you the most recent examples, where on 2 or 3 pages, a summary of global progress, often disaggregated by continental region, against the goals and targets is represented. So the 2021, for example, immediately factored in the onset of the pandemic as a major disruptor to progress in different ways. And you'll see on the left-hand page some pictograms, summarizes a few key findings. And on the right-hand side, in greater detail, a summary of progress in relation to all the targets of Goal 11, which had a 2020 deadline. Most of them run through to 2030, but a few of them had a deadline of 2020. And you can see, without going into all the detail, that they're conveniently color-coded. The ones where they were achieved, where progress is on track, are coded green. The ones with a sort of moving in the right direction but still work to do are coded amber. And the ones where progress is inadequate or non-existent are coded red. The latest report, published in 2021, adopts a slightly different approach, a little bit more text and a series of histograms and an arc representing the proportions under the different sections, which again you can read for yourself. But this is a good illustration of how all the material that is submitted by national governments on behalf of their countries, their regional and local governments, particularly in urban areas, get summarized, get aggregated to the continental level and the global level. And as you can see from those histograms, there are some quite significant, in 1 or 2 cases, even substantial differences across the continental regions, as you might expect, particularly those which are like Europe and North America, members of the OECD, have mostly high incomes per capita as well as in aggregate, and high levels of human development. By contrast, for example, with Latin America, which is more intermediate, Africa, which has many low and lower middle income countries, and likewise South Asia, and to a lesser extent Southeast Asia and East Asia, which again are more mixed. So let's then move to discuss these 3 key characteristics that I've identified as being accessible, green, blue, and fair. These are designed symbolically, if you like, as a conceptual schema, with each trying to encapsulate elements of the holistic and cross-sectoral, cross-cutting nature of, say, sustainability. not focusing on individual sectors, but focusing on key attributes that translate loosely into the economic, the environmental, and the socio-cultural dimensions, respectively, but they're more than that in a way that you'll see explored in the next few slides. Accessibility comprises two related components. The first one is density, usually referred to density of population, which could be measured in people per square kilometer or equivalent. It could be density of people, number per dwelling, so that in areas where you have, like Hong Kong and Singapore, and the centers of many other large cities, dense clusters of high-rise blocks of flats, you'll have a large number of dwellings per hectare and of people per hectare, whereas by contrast, if you have low-density suburbs of large single-story villas, very low density. And how these are interpreted and the limitations will vary. To some people, high density is exciting, it's nice to live, you can support lots of shops and facilities and services and amenities. To others, that's problematic, particularly if services infrastructure are inadequate. And conversely, low-density suburbs are often regarded as the ideal modern living space, but actually they involve high costs of infrastructure per person, per plot, and compared to other areas, but there are lots of debates around it. By contrast, accessibility has a broader focus. It's about physical accessibility, how easily can you reach somewhere, affordability, is it appropriate relative to your needs? So if you are disabled, for instance, is there wheelchair access or lift access or other assistance to make services or transport vehicles, whatever it might be, accessible to you? But it's all about accessing social networks, social capital, friends, relatives, which have very clear links, as we saw underlined quite strongly over the last couple of years with the pandemic and the respective lockdowns, to social well-being, to access to leisure space and its importance, and also to sustainability writ large. The idea of green-blue cities is relatively recent, rather than just green cities. And this is closely related to the history and the evolution of the discipline of urban planning, ideas like garden suburbs and model towns, which go right back to the late 19th century and early 20th century as the antidote to the grim tenements of the Dickensian world and its equivalents elsewhere, and also play a role in sustainability discourses and debates of all sorts. At one level, you might contrast the green agenda of green open space with the brown agenda of meeting basic needs in low and lower middle income countries. Today, the concept of green-blue infrastructure, representing both the dry and the wet, if you like, the land and the wetlands and the water, is about integrating them as part of environmental sustainability, enhancements of urban biodiversity, improving accessibility, transport, avoiding contamination of water and wetlands, and the like. This is also bound up with the discussions I alluded to earlier about narrow versus broad approaches, or strong and weak approaches to sustainability, and more holistic environmentalisms. It also links very clearly, not least through that idea of leisure, of well-being in the context of being able to take exercise, get outdoors, appreciate nature, linked to fairness and accessibility. It's perhaps most widely used in relation to disaster risk reduction and the agendas around climate change. Terms like vulnerability and resilience are very prominent there. And also in the idea of social ecological systems, or economic benefits as reflected in the idea of ecosystem services and the idea that one might pay to have nature preserved in a functioning way so that it can continue to provide us with such ecosystem services. It applies at all scales, right from the individual building or plot, whether they're new buildings or it's about retrofitting for energy efficiency and reducing carbon emissions or upgrading of existing buildings. It's at the level of households. It can be done at the city block or the neighborhood, or comprehensive development or redevelopment of even larger areas like docklands where their original economic usefulness has been outlived and the infrastructure is no longer required, or old industrial areas or mining areas of pit heads and mine dumps, which get cleared as represented in numerous parts of the UK, and large-scale redevelopment as brownfield sites, as opposed to building on previously undeveloped land, which is known as greenfield sites. It's also very important on the urban fringe and in peri-urban areas, which are areas containing some urban characteristics, but also simultaneously some rural characteristics. It can be addressed also at the city regional scale, the functional urban area, as opposed to the built up or the municipal urban areas. And even in terms of integrating urban and rural, these issues are now really, really important. How they work varies hugely. It can be on the basis of the principles of voluntarism, or it can be imposed through regulations and legislation. And one of the key things, again hinted at by the ideas of access to green open space or blue open space, leisure, senses of well-being, as demonstrated most acutely during the pandemic lockdowns, the idea of co-benefits, that these things are valued in their own right, but also for the ecosystem services and the other benefits that can be derived from them. The final characteristic relates to cities being fair. This too has a long pedigree in urban planning, which has often been utopian, or even more modestly, trying to make urban areas better and the quality of life for inhabitants of urban areas much improved. Today it's a very prominent concept, fairness, justice, in critical theory, in all sorts of policy discourses, including the UN and the global sustainability agenda that I referred to earlier. It's all over the SDGs. It recurs frequently in the New Urban Agenda, the Sendai framework, and so on. And it's expressed in different ways. The idea of just cities, cities that are just, which give all their residents ample opportunities, reducing inequalities, reducing or eliminating poverty, having a more equal distribution of resources and access to different parts of the city. It's a social, cultural, spatial, and economic concept, multiple dimensions there. And as I mentioned earlier, there are strong links to accessibility and to the green discourses, and also to policy and practice. Let me then end briefly by pulling together a few key conclusions. The green or green-blue economy discourses, which are prominent today and to which most governments and local authorities subscribe, often still undervalue many of the dimensions and agendas that relate specifically to urban areas and the importance of them to achieving overall societal or national sustainability. These three core terms or characteristics or features of sustainable cities, accessibility, green-blueness, and fairness, are indeed complex. They're often contested, but they are fundamental if we are going to achieve urban sustainability. And going right back to Our Common Future, the report in the Brundtland Commission, it is now incontrovertible that we cannot meaningfully have sustainability at any scale in the presence of substantial poverty and inequality. Therefore, reducing or eliminating poverty, redistributing resources and the basis of access to those resources, and providing all urban residents with justice in the urban system remain key priorities. I'll go even further and say that these principles, which I've tested in research with colleagues in different parts of the world, have clear universal applicability, but not as a blueprint. It's the underlying concepts and principles that need to be adapted and interpreted and applied to local conditions. It's never a simple case of taking a blueprint that has been developed on the basis of experience in place A and trying to implement it without major modification, adaptation in places B or others, because they will not simply translate in that direct way. You're also familiar, I'm sure, with the terms climate change mitigation, adaptation. These are essential for long-term sustainability, but the question is, if they're treated in isolation, how far can they go in addressing the current problems, particularly for the poor and the vulnerable, unless they are part of these comprehensive approaches that actually get to grips with the underlying sources of inequality and of poverty. And finally, and following directly from that, achieving urban sustainability is hugely challenging. And that is because the inequalities, the levels of poverty and deprivation that prevail almost everywhere today, to differing extents, reflect the balance of power relations between particular groups in a community, between certain sectors, between the owners or controllers of large companies, of local, regional, national governments, and basically the vested interests that they seek to defend make it very difficult sometimes to bring about change. There are other constraints imposed by the boundaries of particular boroughs or municipalities, which may not contain the entire urban area. Indeed, it's very common nowadays for large cities to comprise multiple local authorities, and therefore strategic sustainability requires them to collaborate across the metropolitan area or the city region and so on. It is also promoted by different professional groups: engineers, planners, water engineers, transportation specialists, economists, and I could go on, each of which have their own sort of professional language, particular professional rationality. And when you put those complexities together with the perceptions, the priorities of the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots to differing degrees, people who live in different parts of the city, the challenge of trying to forge a sense of shared importance, of shared priorities, of the factors that bring them together being more important than those which separate them, is really, really challenging to achieve in practice. But that would be the subject of another talk. Thanks very much.